Okay, Corine, here we are, as agreed, having a perfectly natural but recorded conversation on and around feedback, which is an issue of interest to both of us and has been in the time for many years that we've collaborated on various things as two independent people who sometimes do stuff together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It would be good to have more of a kind of formal conversation about it and see where it takes us.
Formal? I didn't know you were going to go formal. I should
Oh, sorry.
Minutes then.
Yeah. We all
Okay,
take minutes.
Putting this together, as much as anything else, for the benefit of others, because we've recorded it, we want it to go out there. The sooner we get into it, the better, because people are already thinking, oh, what the hell is this about? So feedback, we're sharing interesting feedback. We've swapped some material around feedback recently. And I know you mentioned yesterday that resistance to feedback is an issue that is well worth knocking about. I mean, feedback in all sorts of ways, how it's done, how rarely there is reaction to. Where do you want to start with this? Because I can just go off on one and you probably need to control me a bit here.
I suppose my thought when I was considering this was the possible damage that the old appraisal system might have had on feedback in businesses, which just occurred to me. I mean, that's changing now, and there's a place for appraisals, but a sense that it was like a 6 month, like an annual event, possibly 6 monthly. Sure. And I feel like there's a throwback to that still, where people, they don't think it's like a regular thing that's there for their performance and their development ongoingly all the time. And that's the thing I keep encountering still. You know,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because feedback for a lot of people in organizations is associated with something formal.
Yeah, no, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
A process,
sit down.
Structure.
Yeah. There'll be a form. We'll fill it out. Yeah.
Which is why it's dreaded, because people see so little value typically from that process. For feedback to be a central aspect of that gives feedback a bad name.
Yeah, absolutely. And people they're not trained to deliver it. They're not trained to receive it. They don't really understand where it fits in. And I'm thinking back to the first time I ever received any feedback in my 20s, and it was awful. I still really clearly remember it, and like I did cry.
I shouldn't laugh. Oh, I'm so thoughtful.
I know.
You're in tears.
And I think I know who it was. I know what she said. And I think, gosh, that must have really impacted me at that age, really vulnerable age. And I think, if we can do something which will help people be more equipped to hear it, even if it's delivered badly, then,
see, I think
that's a good thing.
I mean, there are a lot of issues there. I mean, crikey, we intend to keep this to about 20 minutes. You've already given me grounds for this last 4 hours. I think the giving over the receiving thing, and I know we've both been looking again at the Sheila Heen material, and I think Sheila Heen's good on this in all sorts of ways, not the least of which because she's prepared to have the humility to say, hey, me and Doug Stowe have been writing about feedback for years and years, and we're pretty well thought of. However, we had this sudden enlightenment. We had it all wrong. No matter how well you prepare people to give it, what about how good people are receiving it? Because let's face it, if you don't want to hear what I'm telling you, I could be the world's foremost feedback giver, but if you're not receiving it from me, forget it. It doesn't work.
Absolutely. And it's a physical response to it, isn't it? And if you're not aware that happens to you, and how you react physically to criticism or to any comment. I mean, I had this thing where if somebody said, can I have a few words? It would just be like, can I say a few words? I'd be like, cold hand on my heart. And over the years, so that's been a long time, but I've had to work really hard on feedback because it's so important as a coach. It's just the lifeblood, I think, of what we do.
Absolutely. And I think there's lots of issues there. You've got to have the relationship which is credible, which is authentic, which is empathic, and all those clever words. Basically, you've got to have a credible platform to do it from, because you can't just say to somebody, I want to give you some feedback, because that is the dreaded phrase, isn't it? Which basically, to a lot of people, means I want to criticize you.
Yeah. And I've never said anything positive so far, so it's definitely going to be bad.
I've written a few words here, as I tend to in these conversations ever, and I just think that fundamentally feedback is confused with advice, with criticism, and with praise. It's none of those three things, although it can be perceived as being.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you actually, because a lot of people give praise a lot, but it's just this floaty, superficial thing. Oh, you know,
You're
you did
very
really
good at
well.
your job.
Well done. Yeah, and it's like, you know, and when I encourage people to start practicing with it, I often give them a framework and get them to think about what positive thing they can say, but not just, that was really good, but like the specific, and actually using it for coaching, and how they can actually apply it more, or where they've not seen it as much, or whatever it is, because it's a positive thing, so it will be at least an easier thing to grapple with. And I've found that has helped, but giving them a framework, so they've got a framework to follow, whichever one, because there's a few of them, but whichever one, that really frees them up, I think.
I think you're right about a framework, because to say to people, go and give more feedback, they say, well, that's great, that's a blank sheet of paper, but how? I've never really known. And I think you're making me think of a past life when I used to do a fair bit of assessment of people doing major projects in the workplace, and would go out from Telford to all parts of the country, into Scotland, all over the place, and see them in the workplace whilst they're working on a project, and give them a lot of feedback afterwards. And they were struck by, wow, I've never had this much feedback, which is code for no one's ever been sufficiently interested in what I do to really tell me how well they think I'm doing it. And we only met 6 weeks ago. And it's sad that people who work together for years don't show that interest in each other.
Absolutely, interest, or they're just sometimes just don't have a vocabulary to be able to approach different things. And the thing that I really don't like, even though I do use it sometimes, is how to have difficult conversation. Because I kind of, although that language does make sense to people, I sort of shy away from it, because yes, it can feel difficult and uncomfortable to do, but actually we're talking about having regular, you know, these conversations, is mentioning stuff regularly and talking about it. It shouldn't get to the point, well, you know, it sometimes does, but it shouldn't necessarily get to the point where it's just like, oh my God, I've got to do this horrible.
You mentioned difficult. I mean, I think that for me is one of the heart of the issues, because feedback shouldn't always be negative. I mean, feedback should be something to be looked forward to in the right context. And I know I might be sounding a bit naive here, but I really do believe this stuff. And I think you're right. People dread feedback because the connotation it has with being a negative criticism, what they do. But it should be just as much about saying, Corine, I've seen you do this stuff so many times and you do it so well. I've never sat down with you and told you just how good I think you do that stuff. We don't have those conversations. We don't give. It's not praise. It's more than praise. It is more considered observations of what people do.
Yeah. And actually, with that, when I'm asked people for feedback on coaching, which I have all sorts of clever ways to try and do, because otherwise you just get it was good. The times where I have had, okay, let me think about what you could do so we can make the session better next time, so I focus on the future, there'll be bits of feedback like, oh, I think it would have been great to get to the action planning bit of the session earlier, because I felt that was squished in at the end. I'm like, oh, that's useful, right? That is criticism of me, because I manage the session and I have to take that, and sometimes it can be a bit hard, because sometimes I haven't got to the point where they're actually very skilled at giving feedback. So they'll say something to me, because I've got thick skin apparently, and they can just say it as it is. And I'm like, whoa, that's a bit harsh. But I can remember the times where I've had negative feedback much more than the positives.
Absolutely.
The positives are low.
How often, if you look through the dreaded happy sheets that some organizations impose upon us, and you might see 15, that's great, that's great, that's great, oh, that's not so good. And which is the one that's on your mind when you drive home for 250 miles that night? It's the one of the 15 that someone says didn't really meet my needs, or whatever it was. You think, well, how did I fail this person? The negative feedback definitely sticks.
Yeah, it does. But I think there's two sides to that. There's definitely the negative where actually that wasn't really, yes, it was negative. It's hard to hear, but it probably wasn't really justified in some sense or whatever. But the ones that sticks with me now, since I'm really mature with my feedback, the negative but constructive, the ones where they're saying something negative, but they have actually got a point, and I look at that and think, oh, that is so much more useful for me. Absolutely. Much harder to hear really much, I much rather somebody say you were amazing
Yeah.
than actually I found that first session didn't really get to where we needed to get to quickly enough, and I'm like, oh, what have I done wrong? You know,
Yeah.
I do go
Well,
through that process, but
sorry, I'm interrupting. Second
no, I
time
mean,
today.
no, I've said it. I mean, I just find the ability to be able to work with what they've said is more useful when it's something critical, which I can't believe I've got to that point now.
Yeah,
But
I think you're right. I think there is an ego thing here. There's a preciousness. There's a vulnerability, a fragility. And I think it takes a big person to seek feedback. It takes a big person to react positively to something which is either articulated intentionally or otherwise in such a way that it's perceived as being sometimes harmful.
yeah, it does take work, doesn't it? You do have to work on yourself to be able to go out there and seek it and take it, but not necessarily take everything on board and become complete slave to it, because you
Right.
do have to weigh it up, don't you? And you do have
Yeah.
to understand where that fits into the context of something. If you're giving someone a difficult message, then you get feedback that's difficult to hear, then, well, you know, yes, that might be appropriate that that person feels like that because of what's happening with their business or whatever. So
Yeah.
it is a bit of a skill. That's why I love that article that you mentioned, the Harvard Business Review, because it definitely teaches you a lot about how to hear it, what to do, to what are your hot spots, you know, what are the things, you know, like, hot buttons, that's it. Yeah, so what is it that happens when you hear it in yourself, and can you recognize it? And that's really helped me personally.
I haven't got it in front of me, but and about the triggers that hit, you know, the identity trigger. Oh, this challenges who I think I am. This challenges how good I think I am. You know, we all have these things we're precious about, and I think we've got to question sometimes the validity, the skill, as you say, the articulate feedback. Giving feedback is a responsible thing to do. It has repercussions, it has implications. And giving feedback in the moment without the time to carefully consider what you're saying is not something we often get a chance to do. So therefore, I think that's another reason that people feedback is shied away from, because in the moment, when it means most, we go through this, shall I say something? No, I think I might say the wrong words or annoy them, so I'll say nothing. Instead of having the confidence to say, let me think carefully about what I want to say to you here, because I think it might be helpful.
And actually saying that out loud, because there's something there about going, that I might not say this in the best way, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's important, and saying it. And you know, I find that with when I'm working with people one-to-one, I will sort of say at the beginning, I might say something that's like clunky, but I'm going to say it because it needs to be said, and we'll work on what I actually mean afterwards. But rather than go away and go, oh, I need to put this into a framework and make it really perfect and make sure that I sandwich it between some good stuff and all that rubbish.
Please, I wasn't going to bring that up.
Sorry.
Yes, that's such a nonsense for me. Oh yes, give feedback by all means, but if you've got something someone doesn't want to hear, say something nice before it, say something nice afterwards. This sandwich with the dreaded S word before it, that is such nonsense. If you have to hide behind that process, then you don't have the skill to give feedback directly and
I feel like that is a bit in the past now, really. I don't hear that so much. Do you still find it?
I think I hear it more often than I want, which probably still is less than it was. But I just think that feedback is one of the unusual core skills that are so rarely seen, and that if someone can develop that ability, it's a differentiating competence because it's so unusual.
Yeah. What would you have a particular framework that you quite like? Just thinking about your favorites. I've got one that is a simple one that I quite like sharing with people.
Well, I do. I guess we could go into that, but that might get a bit deep. Maybe for another time we can talk models and frameworks. I'm quite happy to not this one as a general thing. And it's making me think also that the thing about feedback is that when it happens, and when it happens genuinely, either in a group situation or particularly one-to-one, it can be emotive, can't it? It can reach people at a deeper level than just knowledge, cognitive stuff. It actually reaches people's feelings, and you can get an emotional reaction, and we have done. I've seen that. You've seen that. and I think with that again goes responsibility. I just think it's such a good skill to work on. I'm also, if I can, I'm just thinking back to individuals back when I worked for myself for 28 years, but in my first organization, I was approached by somebody who said, it was on one of my management courses, and it was pretty general and not particularly exciting now I look back on it, but it was a run-of-the-mill stuff. But this guy said, I really like the idea of feedback that you mentioned in that. I must have done, it wasn't a big thing. And he says, and I want my colleagues to give me feedback. And I said, are you sure? I knew enough about feedback even then at the tender age of about 6, no, a bit older now. And we actually did this feedback exercise where he asked his colleagues to write down on flip chart basically what they thought of him, and they were really spooked. They were really spooked because they're in this. I remember this so well. They're in this room, about 8 of them. You've got his boss, and because I said I had a few sessions with Phil, and I said, "Do you really want to do this? Do you really know what's going to come?" And bear in mind, I was only about 27, 28. I didn't have much idea for this. I thought, "Oh, that sounds fun," and then I started thinking about it. I thought, "Wow, this guy could get fried here."
Savaged, yeah.
I didn't know these people he was going to get feedback from. It was a great experience, and he came through it well. But more than anything else, I think Phil was really robust. He was brave.
Yeah, it takes courage. Absolutely. Yeah, it really does take courage to do it like that. I mean, when I'm working with teams, you have to know there's a lot of trust in that room to be able to start having those conversations, because it can
Absolutely.
Yeah,
well, people could, in transaction analysis terms, cash in their stamps. Well, Phil, I've never had a chance to say this to you, but I think you're absolutely useless.
I know.
I've
yeah,
never
absolutely.
Say about you in my life.
yeah, and then you don't really get a chance to dig in. Yeah, I still think it's a valuable exercise if done in the right way. But yeah, you're right to have been cautious, and it could have gone either way. But
it went the right way, but it could easily have not, because I didn't know the people involved. With the hindsight I now have, 30 years on, I'd have done it a different way. I'd have looked after him a bit better. I'd have probably made contact with all of them, been more clear about what it was all about and what it wasn't,
and
to protect him. But I think that the gist of this conversation is that feedback is rarely seen, too often hidden away from, is the emphasis where we actually work on the development of skills is on the giver, not the receiver. And the Shiraheen stuff is well worth a look, both in video and article terms, to recommend that we spend much more time preparing people for the receipt of feedback than the giving.
And I feel like it's often thought of as a one-way thing. It's like, I need to give this person this thing. There you go. You've got it. End of conversation. And not even a conversation, but end of delivery, And I always feel like it's a conversation. It's like, I'm noticing this thing. Let's talk about it. And you don't know why that thing's happened. You don't know what's underneath it. And actually what you're trying to do is help them think about what might have prompted it and what they can do or whatever. But I think people get tense because they know it's going to be difficult and they're going to say it and then that'll be it. But yeah.
Well, I think that's very true. And what was I thinking of when you were saying that? Let me just think. Blah, blah, blah. Yes. Don't know. I'm getting so old now, I'm forgetting things. That's why I interrupt so often, because otherwise I forget what I'm about to say.
You've got to say it when you remember it. But yeah, no, I think it's a good sum up, really.
I think so too, which is a good sort of nearing the conclusion thing. So, so from a sort of absolute sum up point of view, I think the key thing for me of all the things is the giver thing. And I suppose where I was going to with that was I was going to ask you, much as we see value in developing the skills of the receiver, have you ever come across anyone doing that? Because I haven't.
Well, actually, that I've come across somebody trying to improve how they receive feedback.
Yeah, and organizationally, have you ever seen an organization that has put any resource, any time into, I mean, when people prepare feedback skills, it's all about the giving.
I've never seen it. I've never seen that be a thing. Yeah, I don't do a great deal of leadership training anymore, particularly, but when we did do it, we did have this double side, to look at the receiver side of it. So it was something we included in there, but it was like, I hadn't seen it at all. I don't think people realize it is a thing, because I think all they think is, I'll flinch, I'll grit my teeth, and I'll kind of like brave it out. And obviously there are other ways to think about it and make it easier.
I think there is, and I don't want to extend this conversation massively longer. And I guess where that hits me with and makes me think is that I'm thinking about languages. It's like if I spoke to you in, I don't know, Lithuanian, no matter how good a speaker of Lithuanian I am, there's no point if you can't make out what I'm saying. Just as if you spoke to me in, I don't know, Swahili. You might be the most wonderfully articulate Swahili speaker, but what's the point of speaking Swahili to me because I can't receive? I think feedback's like that. If you're speaking good feedback skills and I can't take it, skills don't count.
No, absolutely. No, I think you're right, actually. Yeah,
well,
because in some ways it's sort of easier to learn how to receive, and then you take the feedback, and if it's done badly, it doesn't matter as much anymore.
True.
It's actually easier to work on your own development and your own building your sort of confidence with taking it, rather than going, you've got to be really good at delivering it. I think that's a harder skill set. In some ways, if we all got good at receiving and then we just generally did it more, we'd probably get better at doing it, because we'd just do it every week rather than like, you know, this once a month thing. You just become more relaxed at being able to talk about stuff you've seen, and the other person would be interested and curious about, oh really, tell me more, rather than
yeah.
So
I think you're right, and then it becomes this dreaded word cultural. It becomes part of the culture, the way things are done around here, that people will say, Corine, try not to make it hurt, but tell me how you think I could do something important better around here. I'd love to hear that conversation happening in organisations. It doesn't. Right, I think we better end there, because otherwise we're going to go well beyond.
Well, we could talk for about 3 hours, as ever.
Well, let's stop this and have conversation part number 17. Okay, everybody, we're going to finish up there, and we may well have equally as much time after we finish recording. So thanks very much, Glenn. I'm signing us off now.
Bye.
Stopping recording.